Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth QSCP event for 2026. I'd just like to open our proceedings this evening with an acknowledgement of country. So the QSCP acknowledges traditional owners and custodians on the land on which we meet. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and especially acknowledge and welcome any Indigenous Australians who are joining us here tonight. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Eva Skinner. Eva is currently completing a Bachelor in Advanced Humanities with honours at the University of Queensland. She is also an ambassador for the UQ Critical Thinking Project and a research assistant for the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network. She is also on the editorial board for the UQ Exordium Journal. Her areas of interest include philosophy of art, photography, and Albert Camus. And I'll now like to invite her to present her paper on Albert Camus, In Flagrante, the artist as documentary.
I'm going to preface this by saying there's been a lot of debate around how to pronounce in flagrante. I've been saying te till I Googled it today and found out the British pronunciation is T. So if I say te, I'm sorry. It's just come out that way. My honours thesis is on Albert Camus' depiction of art across his works, but today I'm focusing primarily on The Rebel, and I'm centering it on a photographic lens. Photography, unfortunately, is pretty under-researched in philosophy because of how modern it is and because it was almost immediately commercialized, and thus isn't often seen as having a lot of philosophical merit. Obviously, there is a lot of scholarship on photography. Susan Sontag, Alan Zakula, or Roland Barthes have all written extensively on the subject, but I'd like to apply it to an existing theory of art to see how it works within a framework alongside things like sculpture, painting, and novels. The Rebel is a very famous book, and it's a very controversial one as well, as many of you probably know. The book was badly received upon its release. It's widely considered as a rejection of communism, and the current Penguin blurbs for the most recent edition cite this as well. The book is actually, in my interpretation and many others, an anarchist book, and there's thus a rejection of all political theories. I think our tendency to call it a critique of communism is because at the time communism was one of the big forces in France. Following the end of the Second World War, people were widely split between an America and Russia debate for the new world superpower, and people expected people on the left to align with communism, because Camus immediately didn't. And the book does have a few scathing critiques, I will say, even though it's a critique of political ideology more widely. He's been widely characterized as an anti-communist theorist, and I think people lean on this idea today because it suits ideas of intellectuals who aren't communist or being non-communist as an intellectual who writes and publishes literary works. Camus' idea for The Rebel, beginning with a bit of the background on the book before I discuss his idea of art, actually, I believe stems from his reading of Simone Weil at the time. So Camus became very familiar with Simone Weil's works in the build-up to writing The Rebel. He had a lot of her works republished and edited at Gallimard, where he worked and where he was also published. Simone Weil's most famous work, The Need for Roots, as well as the one depicted here on the abolition of all political parties, is very anarchist in the sense that it rejects all political parties and ideology as fallible. So as she says, when a man joins a party, he submissively adopts a mental attitude, which he will express later on with the words such as a monarchist, as a socialist, I think that. It is so comfortable, it amounts to having no thoughts at all. Nothing is more comfortable than not having to think. In Weil's depiction of political parties, individuals who join parties initially are joined due to shared values, but over time succumb to referring to the party for any idea of values or any reflection of political thought or ideas because it becomes easy. It's essentially a rejection of thinking independently or a rejection of thinking for oneself. Over time, you succumb to what the party wants you to do and eventually just become one of many in a uniform measure of thinking. For Camus, any effort to change the world is an act of rebellion. It goes above and beyond political revolt, encompassing any time when someone says no to something or someone. He declares that a rebel actually says yes and no simultaneously. In rejecting one thing, they're actually affirming another thing that they value and uphold. For example, when we reject unfair wages for workers, we're actually valuing justice, fairness, or equality. The problem for Camus in joining a political party is eventually you're rejecting one thing and then just affirming the party itself. You lose sight of your values, you lose sight of what's important, or you lose sight of the reason that you actually hold the political value you're attempting to affirm. This is where he aligns with Weil, and Camus also proposes that when we do this, or when we become aligned to a party, we justify anything in the name of the party because we're not working from a values perspective. So this is when political violence comes into play, or negative political revolt, in which we say we're excused in anything because it's what the party has asked us to do, or because we're supporting the party, which is right. Camus thus supports a form of anarcho-syndicalism, which he says the commune against the state, concrete society against absolutist society, liberty against rational tyranny, altruistic individualism, finally against the colonization of the masses. In this form of political theory, or anarcho-syndicalism, power is held by unions who are able to revolt against the government or the governing body when they're able, or when they want to affirm something. Ideally, there is no state or governing body, and unions simply fight for rights when the people within them feel they need them. And thus you can work individually and you can work from your own values. So Camus' aesthetic of rebellion, or his aesthetics, which he believes is implicitly tied to political rebellion, is rooted in a more general discussion of the problem of rebellion as a social and individual one. It refers to the tendency of individuals subscribed to political ideologies to reduce art to purely utilitarian means, and he says it invalidates the entire process of art itself. We're in the midst of a struggle with art as a society between a revolution which reduces art to a pragmatic tool and a rebellion which maintains true artistic creativity. Art for Camus is an activity which exalts and denies simultaneously. An artist says no to this world in order to say yes to a universe which could possibly supplant the present world. Within his gaze, he sees both what is and what ought to be. He recognizes the truth of the real and rebels in the name of a possible justice. An artist must work from the world in which he is in, but he can also theorize and picture things which may be, or which may improve upon the world or reality in which he sits. Art thus leads us back to the origins of rebellion, to the extent that it tries to give its form to an elusive value which the future perpetually promises, but of which the artist has a presentiment and wishes to snatch from the grasp of history. Creativity, like rebellion, appears from the grounds of refusal. The facticity of the real world is tolerable to a certain degree, but it constitutes itself as a limit. In this, Camus very much rejects the idea of objective history being the total summation of political value or political values or ideals. In this sense, he thinks when we refer to history, when we're trying to further ourselves politically, we're acting as if the sum of human existence can be presented objectively or comes from an objective position. Camus proposes that there is a subjectivity in which we live, and that reflects itself in our art. Thus, art and rebellion appear in the same sort of way, or art helps us see rebellion more clearly. Equally well, no form of art can survive on total denial alone, just as all thought, and primarily that of non-signification. Art provides the opportunity of overcoming his phantoms, his being the artist, and approaching a little closer his naked reality. Thus, we end up in a relationship when we're producing art, where we're working from the world in which we're in, and we're presenting something new. So the artist can't deny his world in its entirety. He's constantly pulled back to reality and thus spurned forward to produce more art or to reject his reality in a new way. So it's an ongoing process. In every rebellion is found to be the metaphysical demand for unity, the impossibility of capturing it, and the construction of a substitute universe. Art is the attempt to create a universe and thus produce the unity which reality as such never provides. These constructed worlds of the artist parallel the constructed worlds of political and social activity. The greatness and opportunity of art is to show that history does not explain mankind. One can reject all history and yet accept the world of the sea and the stars. Camus discusses at length painting and the novel separately, considering the distinct ways in which they represent the act of rebellion and thus the act of art. So the principle of painting is to make a choice. The first thing the landscape painter does is square off his canvas. He eliminates as much as he includes. Similarly, subject painting isolates in both time and space an action that would normally become lost in another action. A painter's style lies in this blending of nature and history, in the stability imposed on incessant change. Art realizes, without apparent effort, the reconciliation of the unique with the universal. The really great artists are those who give the impression that the stabilization has only just taken place. All their subjects give the impression that, by some miracle of art, they continue to live while ceasing to be mortal. They're as symbolic as Christ himself in the paintings he references, Piero della Francesca, and also, I believe, Gauguin. This is debatable. They give a dimension to the painting. They situate him in time and space, even in the cold halls of museums. They lend to him a universe. Camus quotes Van Gogh extensively on painting. I think one of these quotes he uses summarizes his perspective on painting wholly. I can very well in life and in painting too do without God, but I cannot, suffering as I do without something that is greater than I am. That is my life, the power to create. Camus then discusses the novel, which he considers more powerful than the painting, though this is less, he's not as explicit about this, but because of his own tendency towards literature, I believe he emphasizes the novel in his work. What, in fact, is a novel but a universe in which action is endowed with form, where final words are pronounced, where people possess one another completely, and where life assumes the aspect of destiny? For Camus, because they use words which we bring to in reality, and it includes characters in which we can see and situate ourselves, the novel assumes for us something like the real world or an aspect of daily life. When you're reading the story, you can see yourself in the characters. You can put themselves in your position. These are words you know and situations you might imagine for yourself. But a novel has a beginning and an end, and thus occupies its own metaphysical world. Here we have an imaginary world which is created by the rectification of the actual world, a world where suffering can, if it wishes, continue until death, where passions are never distracted, where people are prey to obsessions and are always present to one another. The novel creates destiny to suit any eventuality. In this way, it competes with creation and provisionally conquers death. The novel on this level is primarily an exercise of the intelligence in the service of rebellious tendencies. So, In Flagrante is a photo series by Manx photographer Chris Killip. Though he was Irish Manx, Chris Killip spent most of his time photographing fishing towns along Tyneside in England. This is rooted in many of Killip's ideas that when we discriminate against others or we reject another group of people, it's not rooted in any racism or things like that aren't rooted in anything specific or special. It's simply when we're individuals and we want to be discriminated against, we're willing to homogenize anyone as a group and choose to reject them as a person. In Flagrante is Chris Killip's most famous photo series, though it's really only been reproduced once because Killip himself wasn't a fan of mass producing the work. It was published with writing by John Berger and Sylvia Grant and W.B. Yeats' Ave, Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven. Killip was special in that he knew every single one of his subjects personally. Any area he photographed, he lived in for over a year. He got to know the townspeople, their lives, and their systems of work, and aimed to photograph and reproduce them as they lived. Killip himself didn't consider his work especially political. He liked that it was subjective and rejected the idea of objectivity in art or politics, the idea that one certain theory can summarize all of personal existence. Killip, whenever interviewed, and I've read many of his interviews in the preparation for his talk, is always spoken of in regards to his pure empathy and humanity. People speaking of him and saying they spoke with him, so it felt like they were just speaking with an ordinary man who happened to have a lot of pictures. He was known to get involved in the lives of those he worked with, and in the first publication of the book, produced thousands of mini copies and distributed them amongst the homes of the people who he had photographed. When members of the townspeople had died, he returned to their families and friends the negatives and originals of all images he took of them, and often bound them in books spread chronologically. Killip was well liked where he took photographs and is still discussed in those areas today, those townships which survived. His most famous township, which he lived in for around 18 months, was a seaside town, which appears in a later book called Seacole. In Seacole, Killip lived in a small township right on the beach where individuals had once had a thriving fishing business. Unfortunately, the building of a coal station out in the sea, or a coal mining station, resulted in the people in the town becoming destitute. They funded their lives and their families by stealing coal which washed up on the sea and shores and reselling it at cheaper prices than the coal station sold it for. In his own words, this is a subjective book about my time in England. I take what isn't mine and I covet other people's lives. The book is a fiction about metaphor. Fiction, I think, because it is a story, not just information, about a human tragedy, not an accident. Metaphor, because it is through metaphor that, at first and last, we seek for meaning. Like Camus claims for the artist, we compare the imagined, possible world with our reality, and thus affirm and reject ourselves. So the photographer makes the same choice as the painter. He's delineating something. Photography involves the preservation of the image, the squaring off of the canvas to isolate time and space as the painting does. By presenting aspects of reality in sequence, i.e. as a photographic series suspended or conducted over time, the photograph takes on the aspects of the novel. It presents a new metaphysical world, which conveys a story. We have imprisoned these subjects in a contained body. They now possess a beginning and an end. We begin with them and we end at a last photograph, and thus have a perspective of their lives told in a sort of chronological or narrative style. As Killip describes, these images become a fiction about metaphor. Killip shares Camus' contempt for the prioritization of the objective, historical, and political world. When we relinquish ourselves to the thought that human flourishing exists within the constitute sum of a political theory, we treat our experience like fodder. In his own words, the objective history of England doesn't amount to much if you don't believe in it. And I don't. And I don't believe that anyone in these photographs does either, as they face the reality of de-industrialisation in a system which regards their lives as disposable. To the people in these photographs, I am superfluous. My life does not depend upon their struggle, only my hopes. Now, individualism wants us to view ourselves as individuals who can and should only fend for ourselves. But when an individual is suffering in a system, they desire to posit themselves as a hapless victim. But in order to be a political victim, one must be fighting a force larger than themselves. They position communities of individuals, as I've said, as homogenous groups who are all fallible in the same way. The problem with individualism is people make these groups unstoppably and in perpetuity. Killip's perspective seems a dry take on images that have been interpreted as deeply and explicitly political, generally as a condemnation of Margaret Thatcher's government. But Killip didn't see it that way. First, he never believed his images could make a difference, as he claimed he never believed that photographs alone can be a tool for change. And second, he believed that simply recording people's lives has value, so that they're acknowledged in the here and now, and that so future generations can understand what they did and who they were. By aligning these images with a party or agenda, we can often lose the empathy the artist experiences that does legitimately make these images so effective. Killip sees his photography as a kind of people's history and famously tells a great story to illustrate it, which starts with visiting an American friend. According to Killip, he grew up in a square in the center of Boston. It's been demolished. It's now where the Civic Center stands and all the municipal buildings. But he was standing there, pointing out imaginary streets and who had lived there, who had gone on to make a lot of money, who ended up in jail, who ended up in the mob, or who ended up in politics. We see in Killip's photographs across Tyneside and townships that so much comes from the brightest and best of human instincts. So much that comes from the brightest and best of human instincts is subject to a dry, formal, and orderly disintegration. It is happening here. There were instincts here as strong, courageous, subtle, supple as anywhere, and they were concentrated. Now capital, talent, and energy has left these places. The town seems like a black hole that the hills are about to cave in on. It's Berger, in the written accompaniment to the book, who says, "No new program of the Labour Party, no new merger of the SDP, or for us, the Nationals and the Liberals, not even the Communist Manifesto is going to address the plight of the childhoods, adolescents, virilities, motherhoods, and old ages who have been written off here. They are written off as soon as we hold ideology and forget our motive as people, and that still now they are being ploughed over. The abandoned are born into zones where it is no longer possible to earn a living, and where the idea of any future has been ruptured. The safeguarded are those elsewhere who believe that the future belongs only to the profit motive. The profit motive, however, is always clothed in robes which moralize. For example, as Berger quotes, a secretary to the Northern Cities Chamber of Commerce at the time of the book's publication declared, "There are people who aspire and people who can't or won't. The latter, of course, live in these zones." Sylvia Grant provides an intense literary accompaniment to Killip's images. She extends beyond their frame and contextualizes those represented. In one of her most beautiful passages, she says, "I respect men's brittle strength and feel they are more easily broken." Women are fragile but supple. We don't always break so easy. We crack, we splinter. Ever heard the saying, she was a china teacup, he was only a mug? Those men, I'll never forget those men, the one whose fingers didn't resemble mine, the ones who cried to thank me for staying with them as they smoked a cigarette, the ones who were on the bottom line of for each according to his ability. They'll still be there, still in Cedar Ward. They'll be with me all my life, because they're someone's father, and if they aren't, then they can be mine. My father would have wished it. Forget England made me. Visits to a hospital helped to make me, and to make me angry. Remember the word love. It was often here all through childhood. It was here at the corner shop, on the bus, at the ice cream van. It was a word preceding others and leading to others, a word of progression, movement, a beginning and an end, a word which was around me all the time. Now it's a word we're sensitive of using. We've heard that to use it often is to use it lightly. It never felt that way for me. It was a word with substance, surety, certainty. Among lives which bore so much insecurity and social suffering, there was a word which gave security. And yes, it was love. Today, the shipyards are silent, many of the mines are closed, the factories shattered, and the furnaces are cold. The tragedy of this has little to do with new technology as such, or so-called post-industrialism. It stems and it bleeds not from the fact that science has discovered electronics, from the fact that everything which constituted the loves of those living here is now being treated as irrelevant. Whatever the specific subject, the purpose was usually to move the conscientious public to action or protest so that the social conditions might be improved. Look at what is happening, should this be allowed to continue. These men and women must exist as one sick collective entity as currency to fund the political motivation of those one class above. The existence of poverty is internally inevitable, as without it, where is the middle class's call to arms? How to justify their violent dogmatic politicism without flaunting others' suffering? Sometimes the future was invoked in a more triumphant sense. Look at the richness of the family of man. We must do justice to our global heritage. In Flagrante does not belong to this tradition. Chris Killip is adamantly aware that a better future for those he photographed is unlikely. The debris visible in his photos, the debris which surrounds his protagonists, is already part of a future which has been chosen, and chosen according to the laws of our particular political system and democratically. In the sky beyond every photograph in this book is reflected the blind indifference of the new individualism, which Sylvia Grant discusses extensively. Finally, history will not forgive this indifference. Meanwhile, in its monstrous light, something else becomes visible. What has become visible and obvious is that this is a lie. This first equality has been won. It confers no protection, guarantees no rights. It simply recognizes that those living today in the zones of abandonment differ in no essential way from anybody else. In Camus' perspective, we are so dependent on political parties or ideology to remind us of this integral equality that we forget what makes us so important, that the pure heart of equality is a genuine love and admiration for the human and other people. Sylvia Grant's most beautiful anecdote, which I include here as well, states, "I saw an elderly man with a Tesco carrier and a walking stick. I was on the escalator going down and the one going up was, as usual, broken. If there's a certainty in life, it's that the escalator going up is broken and your shopping bag is full. He was walking up the endless stairs and mildly struggling, only struggling mildly. If he had been more obviously disabled or had been a mother struggling with a shopping cart and a pram, he would have rightly inspired sympathy. He was just a little tired, unknown man struggling mildly. This beautiful individualism they talk of. By the time this particular man reaches the top of the stairs, his individual legs will feel too tired for this particular concept to bloom. Of course, if he had power, money, or even just a car, his individualism might flourish. I don't understand what political people of power mean by that word. Lots of people I know on estates, in hospitals, in unemployment queues, now walk on their individual knees, and their individual heads are bowed, and they haven't the energy to straighten their individual spines." Killip's images of the sea coal beach, where people scavenged for coal washed up on a nearby power station and mine, show a landscape and a community that have now vanished. In an interview a decade later, Killip shared, "It's all been landscaped into a golf course. The power station and the coal mine have been demolished." It's very disconcerting because one wonders, did this happen? If you went there, you would have no clue that this is where all this happened. But I have the evidence. It's kind of fascinating. Photography holds Camus' uniquely political aspect of art inasmuch as it represents that tender human relationship with reality. Through the lens, we see clearly those sea and stars and trap them in art's contained universe. It's a tender and vulnerable allegiance we have, the looker and the exposed, an association that cannot remain innocent of the crimes of life or of crimes at all. A love that cannot lie with you, but by lying in you cannot lie dormant. There is so much love cannot do, but it can oppose laws, callous, calculated, and protracted, which intensify poverty, castrate your aspirations, compound that fracture of intimacy from which you will find it hard to rise. Yet the struggle for meaning, which is waged in every soul, is imminent in time itself. And in this struggle, nothing is repeated. Everything is unique, and somewhere is ineradicable. In Grant's words, I have no proof of this. It is an article of faith, which I think I share with most of the protagonists in this book. It's a very Sisyphusian conception of things, a struggle for meaning in an indifferent world. It's also the rejection of Camus' rebel. I affirm I am here in reality and suffering, and thus I reject this in the hopes of justice. It's ineradicable because we cannot eliminate the part of us which rebels. Killip's book makes us aware of this feeling in ourselves. We are looking at the struggle of others, and we are feeling that same rebellion. As Burgess says, Killip himself finishes the book with a poem by W.B. Yeats. And in Burgess' words, the poem sears the photographs like the branding of hundreds of cattle. I will finish on the same poem. Thank you. Spoken very, very fast, I've realized. And as was indicated to me by some patrons in the front row.
We have plenty of time for questions. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
Right from the beginning, when you're talking about political parties and not being part of it, I mean, felt it was important not to be part of a political party because your thinking was sort of very shaped by that thing. What's the alternative when you're running a country? What alternatives are there to how do you concentrate power in a way that is democratic or equitable, or you don't have political parties?
It's pretty interesting. I mean, if you're a narco-syndicalist, because it's basically unions at turns come forward and advocate for the rights of the people in those unions. So you find you generally discern and learn your rights through your workplace. It's an interesting way of running things, and it's not the way I would pick. I think more specifically, you need more political parties and you need to be willing not to subscribe to them. So he wasn't blanket against all ideology, but the problem he and Simone Weil identified, I think, is that when people become very involved in a party or ideology and they view that ideology, I suppose, as the remedy to living, then you're much more willing to accidentally surrender values or ideas because you're so subscribed to that this is the truth or what you believe in. So I think people need to be more willing to change, and people need a bigger diversity of options, and ones that aren't implicitly tied to ideology, but maybe wrapped up more in what's happening at the time or people's values more specifically.
They're suffering becoming fodder for the middle class's political motivations. I understand that, but if that's not a healthy alternative, then in terms of how to help or like how things be changed if it's not with like people with a little bit more political power using it.
I think what Killip's idea around the book was that when it was released, it was like taken as like an indictment of Margaret Thatcher, and like massively spread as like, this is the best anti-Thatcher book ever, which made him really angry. Not because he was pro Margaret Thatcher, but because he was like, the value of the book is that people read this and see the idea of justice in raw and in its of itself. So he was like, we want to be helping people in these groups and feel empathy for them. But the problem is when we see the book and we go, great, this is such a good argument against Thatcher, we should be like, wow, this is why we hate Margaret Thatcher. And he found he had a real issue in a lot of the interviews I read where he would talk to the people in the interviews and he'd ask them, oh, do you know the name of the town this is a photograph of the person that's photographed? Because it was important to him. And I haven't read an interview where they can answer him. I think he had a real issue with we want to help people who are lower class or of a different class, but we're going to help the lower class rather than having like a more human or intimate, empathetic connection with him, which I know is difficult, but I suppose I hope that's the right answer.
Thank you for a very rich and fascinating presentation. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about philosophy expressed in the form of novel or like Camus' contemporary stuff and that used the novel a lot to explore their philosophies and explain it. I'd love to hear any thoughts about that.
I had it in this is a Frankenstein of like 9 versions of this presentation, which may be why it's happened so quickly because I've ran over time and then I redid it and I was under time. So, but there's a really interesting part where he talks about where he discusses like in general the idea of the character and how great characters are, because when you're reading about a character, you're like, they're having thoughts and feelings and stuff, which is something I have. So you'll see themselves much more through their journey. For me, maybe I'm projecting onto Camus here. When you're reading about when I'm experiencing philosophy, it's tied to my own thoughts and feelings and the experience. So when you're reading a philosophical novel and you're reading those things, the concept's easier to get your head around because it's rooted in an empathetic and thought-based experience. You're thinking this character is thinking and doing this and feeling this, and it results in a more personal emotional connection for you, which I think is what makes novels. I think that's what appealed to him particularly about the novel, and the fact that it is contained. So you can because it's the world that's philosophical, you can take a part of the world, condense it into a story, and then you have almost like he calls them like a metaphysical universes or new universes, which you can have and possess, read, and thus experience the idea in this condensed form in a way that is rooted in your world, but separate, and thus you can pick the parts of the world that best express the idea.
Like 16th century culture piece, would we argue that that is also like this own metaphysical world exists on its own? But then on the other side, we take like an abstract expressionist painting. Can we say that it is entirely subjective and doesn't represent anything universal? Like Camus has described painting to be.
Camus was really unpopular with the surrealists for this reason, because they were like, there's nothing objective in what we're doing. It's meant to be really surreal. I think you could argue at any point if you really wanted to that because you're making it in the real world and you're producing it as part of your life and experience, you can't completely cleave it from reality. I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering the question here, but everything is like rooted in like a relationship between a person and the artwork, and thus has a little bit of that human experience in it. So even if it's not like objective, when you're seeing it, you're seeing something human in it as well, and that's what makes it fascinating. I think it's more like being a human is a priori. And thus, so when we do things, in the Myth of Sisyphus, he discusses art as like this distinctly human activity because it's so absurd and such an absurd thing to be doing. Only really we could be up to it. So I think it's more like being a human, and being in our human position is priori or universal. So thus, like when we see like these human-centric objects or activities, there's like the connection there.
Sorry if you touched on this, but I was thinking about how the photos simultaneously sort of capture like a point in time, but also the series of them sort of contain like the journey of the people, like before and after, like the issue with the cold, sort of like the tragedy of commons, where that was taken away, and then the greed sort of ruined it for the town. I feel like, is it more supposed to be capturing like the individual moment, like before and after, or is it about like the journey overall of the photos? So that was a bit poorly worded.
No. I think I know what you mean. I think the really great thing about photography is that every photo is individual, like an individual art piece. And then photographers, I mean, it's becoming less common practice now. You would at a certain point in your career produce a photo book. And this is my chronology of photography. And thus it becomes a story in itself. The journey of In Flagrante is pretty interesting because it was more like it's the curlews. Sydney said she'd laugh if they did that. So it's like more like just showing that over this extended, over a decade period, that these things just persist and more that they're like this common part of life. So the journey you're experiencing is just one of like, it's those combined feelings of in a lot of these photographs, people are together. And then there's like a real distinct loneliness and destitution to them, but you can view them individually and have the same feeling. It's just when they become a narrative, it's more encompassing. Yeah.
As in like individually, the photographs like highlight something that's happened, but then when you view them together, it becomes a highlighting of different forms of the same.
Yes. Yeah. It's a very excellent photo book. I would recommend to all.
Thanks so much for that. I guess as I was listening, I was struck by these like eating figures of the individual, like the Thatcherite idea, there is no society, everyone's just an individual. This idea that we are all these kind of like unique autonomous units. And then the way that Camus characterizes the individual in his own like fiction, characterization of Paul and in the Plague as well, but it's something that they kind of touch on each other in some way. But what do you think, how do you think perhaps he and the way individuals are kind of framed in these photos differentiates them from the figure that we get from kind of Thatcher and conservatism as the individual is this unique, autonomous, unit of value?
That's an awesome question. And it was in my speech and I got so anxious, I skipped the paragraph. But there's the contrast between groups and communities. So if you're in a community, you're a person. So, I mean, Camus talks about the individual or like individual values and ideas, but you're part of a community. So there's people with similar values and ideas and you become linked to them. Like, I don't know if you think like a little monkey chain, like they're all the individual monkeys, but when they're together, like, wow. Whereas the idea of individualism allows people to be put into groups. So I'm an individual, but then I can characterize other people in groups because I'm an individual looking out on everyone else. So I can be like, this is the group of people who live in Tyneside and they suck and they're stealing all the coal from my husband's coal station. And you're not viewing them as a community. So a group of people with hopes, fears and thoughts and thinking they're all together because they share that they're living in poverty on this beach area or that they're all together because they're living in this like unique group struggle. I'm just thinking that's the group of people and they become like really homogenous in this ugly way. And it's where I think a lot of like the problems with when Killip discusses like I'm the individual, when people of a certain group want to feel beset upon, which maybe we've all experienced, they have to posit themselves as an individual against an entity. So I will be like, I, as a middle-class white woman, am beset upon by the entity of this group of people, and thus it makes my suffering more legitimate because I'm, Samson against Goliath. When that's not the case, you're homogenizing people without realizing why you're doing it.
I hope I understood your talk about this not sounding good. So it seems that the public reception to the book was one which sort of aestheticized the politics of the Thatcher regime from an anti-Thatcher position, in a sense that the pictures were taken to sort of be almost knock down evidence that Thatcher was bad, and but it was sort of an uncritical. This was an uncritical, sort of non-argumentative form of presenting this idea. And then I'm wondering, would you say that I've characterized that okay?
Yes. I think Killip has an interesting thing where he went and lived in these communities for about, I want to say 6 or 7 years. He lived there for a long time and yeah, I'll say 7 or 8. He became really familiar with the people who lived there and developed this distinct sort of empathy. And I know with friends who've gone to rural areas and done political work with them, they've gotten when I talk to them, they have a much better, more rounded idea of the specific problems these people face and who they are and the way they think. And there's like a really beautiful sort of special type of empathy people get when they've lived in an area for a long time. And he took all these photos and he knew all the people. And I think he produced this book with the idea that people would come out with the same rounded empathy, that the way we're doing our democracy is wrong because we're hurting people, or even when we're trying to uplift people in our democracy, there's this bottom layer of people that's just getting left behind, or like that we need necessarily to be mowed over to move everything along. But the book was obviously went to people purchased it and they were like, this really represents what's wrong with Thatcher specifically. When photos in the book, most of the photos in the book were taken before Thatcher was in power. So he was like, we're doing the thing that we always do where we're picking the problem. Like everything went wrong at this point, but the thing that went wrong was we just forgot a bunch of people, was more his thing.
So in that, so if that's the case, do you have any idea of how photography can be used in a way that politicizes the art rather than aestheticizes the political, as Killip was intended? And do you see that aligns with the rebellious, the rebellious picture that Killip gives?
I think the photographs need to be paired with philosophy is a lot of my ethos on this. I think when I looked through the book and I was like, this is just like The Rebel, and then I read Killip's interviews and I, was like, oh, he agrees with me. I could write a paper on this. It's like I think when people do have a particular philosophical accompaniment with works, particularly if they're delving into looking at art or photography in a particular way for the first time, philosophy really helps. I know looking at Camus, who published his works in cycles, I remember reading The Myth of Sisyphus the first time and being like, I don't know what that's on about. And then I read The Stranger and I was like, wait. And then I went back and read it and I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like the idea is so much more distinct. And I think when people do make politically inclined photo works like this, I think it helps to have philosophy accompaniment or a suggestion for people to read to get a better idea of your message. And I think a lot of this, I think photography, particularly at the moment, has a really bad problem because it's so commercialized and anyone can do it. Like it is an anyone activity, and everyone here, you've all got an iPhone. You can take it out and take a photo right now. It's not an exclusive activity anymore, so it's really hard to root it amongst the arts or give a proper artistic conception of it, which is why it languishes so badly. So photography specifically, I think, has this problem. I think it needs a philosophical accompaniment at the moment, and it's also reminiscent of a bigger problem in our politics and our education system, particularly the way we teach the arts, that people so constantly misidentify art or misidentify the value in it. So the classic answer, it's a problem with society. Yeah. Yeah.
Really, you need to give that talk 40-something years ago.
Yeah, well, a guy put a photo book up about it and it didn't work.
Did you say it was only printed once, as if there was only like one round?
It had a couple print rounds, but he capped the numbers. And then, so it was first printed in 1988, and it had a couple very limited print rounds till the 90s, at which point he cut it off. And then in the 2000s, an In Flagrante 2 was released, which included more photos and more text, which unfortunately didn't help the case and wasn't as popular upon its release because people had moved on to new. Margaret Thatcher was gone, and it was like the social sentiment surrounding it was gone. And interestingly, the book wasn't nearly as popular or isn't nearly as well documented. And same as he released a specific book, Sea Coal, also came, it petered out and went. So you can get copies of it, but they're very expensive. So it was more like he stopped having the book published after a certain period of time, and I think he kept it at like 1,000 per print run, which is a lot for a photo book, but not a lot for a famous photo book.
Do we know about or did he visualize himself?
He gave his archive over to Magnum Photos, which, if anyone doesn't know, is Cartier-Bresson started Magnum Photos, and it's the B. If you're a photographer and you've made it, you're in Magnum Photos. So they now have control of the estate and digitize a lot of it in order to distribute photography. He didn't ever say anything on it, and he became very private towards the end of his life. He gave interviews sparingly because they all asked him to talk about this book, and he got really sick of it. But I think he liked that the photos were distributed, and he often would be very friendly with people who, if people wrote like philosophical ideas of papers on it, he liked that it was being reapplied in the arts. So I would say he would feel positively, but I do also know he struggled with the fact after people who were pictured in the book passed away, he was very upset that they were distributed without their families ever knowing. And part of the reason he went back to some of the towns was to try and let them know, and he couldn't because they were golf courses. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to that question.
To what extent do you think Killip can really call himself a documentary photographer when so many of these images still have an element of manipulation or artistry? So they're all black and white. He would have chosen which images to leave in, leave out. There's composition. He chooses which angle to photograph his subjects.
It's a very interesting question. I think he liked to be called like a historian, but like a artistic historian. So he was like, I'm preserving pieces of people's lives and thoughts. Documentary photography is a really tough area because, especially now, because people can Photoshop anything and change anything. And these are very aesthetic photographs and chosen for a very specific purpose. So I would say, wow, that's a really tough question. I would say he wouldn't want to be, but I think he is a very good documentary photographer because he kept the photos directed towards their initial purpose. And that makes him effective in that sense, though, because they do also serve an aesthetic purpose. It isn't documentary in the same way a historical record would be. It offers something slightly different, but not bad.
They can still testify to a reality that didn't happen.
Yeah. It wasn't, they're all silver gelatin prints, so they can't really be doctored. So it's like a certain type of printing where the photo is printed with like heavy chemicals on a piece of thing before they're reproduced. So they're difficult to manipulate, which lends themselves to their documentary quality, and it's not really a technique that's used anymore. So I think they're pretty trustworthy in that sense, and I think they testify well to his idea.
By manipulation, I meant more in the camera.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. It is tricky as well because everyone he photographed knew they were being photographed. So people naturally change themselves for an image, though a lot of them looked to be caught in the moment. They knew him. He knew everyone well, and they would have been like, oh, the camera guy's here. Even though the guys in the top left stayed sniffing glue.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you, Eva, for your presentation. And before everyone goes, I just have a few advertisements on behalf of the QSCP. So our next presentation is here. It's on the 4th of June, same time, and Dr. Sarah Pope is going to be presenting on feminism versus feminism. You'll have to read it to see the difference between those two terms. The effects of the trad life movement on Australian girlhood. And also on Thursday, the 18th of June, we have Connor Jenner. All right, here. And he's going to be presenting on the worst is yet to come, how the dystopian imaginary enables ethical subjectivity and political agency. So please come along to those as well. Thank you once again, Eva, for that amazing presentation.